Hey, Bastish B here for 64K and welcome to my new show, One Man and His Machine. So what's this show going to be about? I'm basically going to do little mini profiles on really cool video game programmers, designers, or musicians. It's going to be different every single time. Whether these guys were from the classic computer generations from the 80s or the consoles from the 90s, it doesn't matter. It's going to alternate. And today's profile is going to be Manfred Trenz, a really prolific Commodore 64 programmer. He has his machine of choice. Let's check out the early years. Manfred Trenz is a game designer, graphic artist and programmer born in 1965 in Saarbrücken, Germany, and is probably best known for the Turrican game series. But there's a lot more to the story than that. So let's go back to his programming origins in 1984, a year where Frankie Goes to Hollywood could just not stop telling us to relax. The Temple of Doom managed to deliver heart-ripping, monkey brain-eating child slavery all wrapped up in a neat PG-13 package, and Band-Aid proved that no matter how much talent you throw at something, it doesn't necessarily make it good. But most importantly for this story is that Manfred was introduced to his friend's Commodore VIC-20, where they spent hours messing around with basic programs, getting sprites to do arbitrary animations, and just enjoying the art of coding. The spark was lit. Manfred's passion for programming was immediate, and he absolutely loved it. In 1985, he bought himself a Commodore 64 and went about studying the manual and all the ins and outs of BASIC he could possibly figure out. He made his first game, a simple helicopter program similar to the classic Fort Apocalypse, to test out all he had learned. It was way too slow, and he felt if he wanted to improve his programming, he would actually have to make his own programs for coding, because BASIC wasn't going to cut it. He also started to experiment heavily in graphics, where he drew some of these background images, which would be used in another unreleased shooter game that he was experimenting with at the time. Later that year, he met a fellow programmer, Kurt Weisskopf, and they both collaborated on a bunch of demos and graphics. 1986 rolled around, and a German Commodore magazine, 64, was having a graphics competition, and Manfred sent in a bunch of his stuff. As seen here, he ended up winning 3rd place. But more importantly, he was noticed by a then young software company called Rainbow Arts through the magazine. They immediately contacted him and asked if he'd want to work with them freelance and do some graphics for a bunch of their games. Obviously, he eagerly accepted and managed to get his foot in the door. Little did Rainbow Arts know at the time, but he had become quite a skilled programmer at this point and was about to unleash his first big project. With 1987 rolling around, they made him a permanent member of the team, and his first full game was greenlit. Let's stop for a minute, and let's take a quick little look at Rainbow Arts, the software company that Manfred was so influential at. Rainbow Arts were a German games publisher founded in 1984 by Mark Ulrich, and were defunct in 1999 when they were merged into THQ Deutschland. In their 15 years of existence, they managed to release over 50 games for multiple formats. At the heart of their games publishing were the Commodore 64 and the Amiga, which they flourished in, and were able to make countless classics for those systems, like the Great Giana Sisters, the Turrican series, and Catechus, amongst many others. They were also a company that got themselves into a lot of legal trouble multiple times over a couple of games designed by Manfred himself, which we'll take a look at pretty soon. They were also very adept at gathering some of the best German programmers and musicians under their wing, who all went on to their own excellent careers outside of Rainbow Arts. People like game developer Armin Gessert, who went on to form Spellbound Entertainment, makers of the Desperado series, Thomas Hertzler, who ended up founding Blue Byte, makers of the popular Settlers series, and musician Chris Hulsbeck, who's had a remarkable video game soundtrack career from the 1980s to now, with many C64 and Amiga classics, as well as modern and successful Kickstarter anthology albums. And of course, their star programmer himself, Manfred Trenz, whose body of work at Rainbow Arts came to define the company as a whole. And that's the cue to move on to the games. So Manfred Trenz is responsible for so many games in the late 80s and early 90s that I just absolutely love. One of them there is Catechus, excellent scrolling shoot 'em up. So let's jump back into his back catalogue and check out my personal favorite games. First up is the 1987 platform game, The Great Giana Sisters, which was Manfred's first full product as game level and graphics designer, with Chris Hulsbeck providing a wonderful score for the game. The overall result is an excellent adventure in the Super Mario Bros. Tradition. If you look past the first few levels, which are almost exact replicas of Super Mario Bros. On the NES, it's an amazingly well designed and fleshed out platform experience. It did unfortunately catch the all-seeing eye of Nintendo, who threatened a legal battle if the game wasn't recalled. Rainbow Arts basically had to comply, which makes physical copies of this one go for such insane prices. Luckily for most C64 owners, the cracking groups of the 80s made sure everyone would get a chance to play this awesome game. 1988 saw the release of Catechus, a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up. The graphics and music in this game are absolutely fantastic, and it plays brilliantly in two-player co-op as well. Manfred headed up coding on this one, with Hulsbeck providing another amazing SID soundtrack. Manfred's love for referencing games that he liked, like the Gianna Sisters, got Rainbow Arts into trouble once again, as the roving eye of Activision was not to please the Catechus, which was an obvious homage to R-Type. Activision, who had the R-Type home license at the time, gave them an ultimatum: code the C64 version for them in 6.5 weeks for its release date, or we'll sue. Catechus was quickly recalled, renamed Deneris with some changes to make the R-Type references less obvious, and re-released, which leads us to Manfred's other 1988 6.5 week conversion of the R-Type arcade game to the Commodore 64, which by all accounts should never have been possible, but it turned out excellent and is a fantastic port of the classic RM arcade game. Graphics, sound effects, and another unforgettable opening tune by Hulsbeck round out another must-play in its C64 back catalog. 1990 gave us the run-and-gun marvel that is Turrican, which is one of the C64's best games in this genre. Another absolutely groundbreaking programming feat which shouldn't have been possible for the system to handle, but Manfred made it happen. He performed coding and graphics, and Hulsbeck, Hartwig, and Baker provided a memorable soundtrack to the sublime shoot-'em-up platformer. Countless different versions of this game were made, but this still is the true original. 1991 gave us the all-out madness that is Turrican 2, which pushes the system further with bigger levels, scrolling shoot-'em-up segments, and massive bosses, and an all-round excellent run-and-gun platforming gameplay experience. Programming was done by Manfred, graphics by him and Andreas Escher, and yet another amazing SID soundtrack, this time by Marcus Siebold. 1992 was a busy year for him with the release of Enforcer, Full Metal Mega Blaster on the C64, which was a scrolling shoot-'em-up tour de force, amazing graphics, and another game that melts every single chip in the C64 as you play it. Manfred did the graphics and coding, with Marcus Siebold again busting out a rocking soundtrack that had absolutely no bad tracks across the entire game. This is a must-play shooter, and unfortunately it was Manfred's last C64 game. Also in 1992 he did a remix of Turrican 1 and 2 on the NES, known as Super Turrican, which he not only programmed but also did the graphics, music, and sound effects. So he basically one-manned this crazy port, which is really quite an impressive game on the NES. And one of the last of my favorite games that I wanted to highlight is 1995's Super Famicom only release of Rendering Ranger, which blows my mind that this game was never released outside of Japan. The game mashes Contra and Turrican together for this visual explosion that is well worth the effort to track it down, and is possibly his least known game, which is an absolute crime. So what has he been up to since he's left the Commodore 64 scene? Well, in 1999, THQ announced that they were working on Turrican 3D, which Manfred was spearheading with a large production team. Unfortunately, the game was cancelled after 2 years of development. It was supposedly heading for the PC with a rumored Dreamcast version as well. THQ ended up cancelling the game in late 2000 without any real reason given. In 2004, Manfred founded the software company Deneris Software Entertainment, where he proceeded to release many console and handheld games for the PS1, Game Boy Color, Nintendo DS, etc, etc. Roughly 7 or so games were released through the company, with only CT Special Forces on the Game Boy Advance that I would honestly say is worth playing. It's a typical game in the Manfred style, where the inspiration is clearly obvious, aka Metal Slug, and it's a really cool game to check out. And that wraps it up. I just want to do a quick shout out to the Manfred Trends fan page. I got a lot of really good information from there. Some of it's in English, some of it's in German, so you have to muddle your way through it if you don't know German. I'll put a link in the description. There's a lot of cool information there to check out. And thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. If you could like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. Cut to credits.